least 100 million years worth of uranium decay had to occur while you blinked during the flood. So this is evidence, physical evidence, that not only that abundant nuclear decay has occurred during the flood, but there has been abundant nuclear decay. Millions, hundreds of millions of years of nuclear decay occurred within the single year of the flood. And you see what I mean? We've now got 4 independent lines of evidence that decay rates were accelerated during the flood. Well, there's more. You've been waiting for this all night, haven't you? Radiocarbon. Everybody knows about radiocarbon, and we find it in fossils. You mightn't believe it, but we do. The scientific community has recognised this for many years, and they've never looked at the implications. Radiocarbon is different from the other elements I've talked about. Why? Well, it's formed differently. Cosmic rays in the upper atmosphere produce fast-moving neutrons that collide with nitrogen-14 that produces carbon-14 in the upper atmosphere, which combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. It's in the air you breathe, and you're all tonight a threat to public health and safety because you're all radioactive with radiocarbon. It was in the food that you ate tonight for dinner, and we should put out a sign out there that this actually should be a nuclear-free zone, and we wouldn't let you in because you're all radioactive with radiocarbon. Now, think about it. As your body then, you go on living, the carbon-14 that you took into your body decays away and returns to nitrogen-14. And as long as you eat more food, you're going to get more radiocarbon, aren't you, to replace that which is decaying away. But your great-great-great-grandmother, when she died, she stopped eating. So since her bones have been in the cemetery, she's got less and less radiocarbon in her bones, so it's kept on decaying back to nitrogen-14. So it's quite simple. If you want to know how long, whether the tombstone is correct in when she died, you measure how much radiocarbon is in her bones and compare it to the amount of radiocarbon in your bones. And the difference, you know how quickly radiocarbon decays, you can calculate how long ago she died. That's how the method works. It's really quite simple. But here's the interesting sidelight to this story. As I said before, the equipment that is used today is so powerful that you can actually count individual radiocarbon atoms, carbon-14 atoms. However, the detection limit is as good as 0.001% of the present level of carbon-14, which is equivalent to 95,000 years. That's right, you can only go back, theoretically, you can only go back 95,000 years with radiocarbon. You don't date fossils at millions of years with radiocarbon. The reason is that radiocarbon has a half-life of 5,730 years. And it means that any ancient organic carbon conventionally older than 95,000 years, like dinosaur bones, should contain no detectable radiocarbon. Let me put it another way. If every atom in the Earth was radiocarbon, within 1 million years it all have decayed away. There'd be none left. So that's why the scientists never used radiocarbon to date fossils at millions of years. But here's the embarrassment. Even in the secular literature, yes, it's already published in the journal Radiocarbon and one other secular journal, you actually find dates, radiocarbon measurements on fossils that are supposedly up to 500 million years old, and they all have radiocarbon in them. Why did they never tell us that in their textbooks? In fact, they're all young. They're not 500 million years old. So you see, I was mischievous a little while ago, and I decided I'd collect some samples and send them to a radiocarbon lab. But I didn't tell them how old the sample was, so I sent them a piece of fossilised wood from a 189 million year old rock in England. And guess what? It returned a radiocarbon age of only 24,000 years. I took a piece of coal from Australia that's only 250 million years old supposedly. It gave an age of 33,700 years. And I went up to Northern California and collected samples of ammonite shells with fossil wood next to them. Okay? And these are supposed to be 112 to 120 million years old. And look at the radiocarbon. The wood and the shell almost match one another. I had 4 samples like this, and some of them were almost exactly the same, in the same two different materials. So what we did in this RATE project, we decided to take coal samples from different parts of the United States that are stored at Penn State University by the US Department of Energy. And here's the samples. 3 of the samples were from coals that are supposed to be 34 to 55 million years old. 3 of the samples were from coal beds that are supposed to be 65 to 145 million years old. And 4 of them were from coal beds that are supposed to be 299 to 318 million years old. And you can see they've come from a wide distribution around the United States. And guess what? They all had radiocarbon in them. In fact, they all had about the same amount of radiocarbon in them. They were all about the same radiocarbon age. Surprise, surprise. Where did all these coal beds form? Right, during the flood. They all formed in 1 year. All these trees lived just before the flood. Would you expect to give you the same radiocarbon age? Absolutely. Whether they were supposedly 300 million years old or 40 million years old, they gave the same radiocarbon age. Isn't it great to be a creationist, as my good friend John Morris used to say? Well, we went further. We also took diamonds that are made up of carbon to see if the diamonds would have radiocarbon in them. These are conventionally dated at 1 to 3 billion years old. And yet all these diamond samples contained measurable radiocarbon regardless of whether they were 1 to 3 billion years old. So, we found similar amounts of measurable radiocarbon in coal samples regardless of their conventional age. These represented, of course, pre-flood plants buried during the flood, all at the same time. So it wasn't surprising to find that they all gave the same radiocarbon age. Yes, it was inflated, and I'll explain why in a moment, but they all gave the same radiocarbon age. And the same with the deep earth diamonds. These diamonds come from 200 miles down inside the earth. Most people don't realise they come from 200 miles down inside the earth by explosive volcanic action in just about 2 hours. And yet they had radiocarbon in them regardless of their claimed billions of years ages. And with a diamond, this can't be contamination because diamond is the hardest substance known and it's impervious to contamination. So this has to be radiocarbon that is in situ to the diamonds when they formed at the time the earth formed. And of course, not only were the coal layers therefore formed at the same time during the flood, but these deep earth diamonds must have formed at the same time as the earth itself. And so we got a direct measurement of only thousands, not billions, for the age of the earth. Well, we can conclude that because these uncalibrated radiocarbon ages confirm the biblical time scale for a young earth in the recent flood, then the conventional ages of millions and billions of years derive from the long ages of decay of the uranium and the potassium and the rubidium, etc., must have been grossly accelerated if the radiocarbon has given us a closer estimate compared to the biblical timescale. So again, we have a 5th line of evidence of accelerated nuclear decay during the flood. Well, finally, let's turn all this from being our foe to being our friend. We've shown that there's problems with these dating methods, but if radioactive decay was grossly accelerated during the flood, then the radioactive ages, though inflated, should still yield relative ages in the correct order. What do I mean by that? Well, think about a volcanic rock layer that formed in the first month of the flood. It would go through much more accelerated nuclear decay than a rock layer that was formed in the last month of the flood, wouldn't it? The one at the bottom would have 12 months worth of accelerated nuclear decay, so it should give an older age, and the one at the top should only have a month's worth of accelerated nuclear decay, so it only give a younger age. See? We can turn it from being an enemy to being a friend, to give us, so that means we can go from the known to the unknown and use this method to help us to understand the relative order during the flood, for example. Many of the accepted radioisotope ages, as I said, do match the relative order of the strata and their relative ages. So when we can't figure it out, the age of some rock layers from their immediate environments, it may be possible to use the radioactivity in the rocks as a guide to the relative age of these rock layers within the flood, whether it was early flood, middle flood, or late flood. So we can still harness this method to our advantage. If we knew what the acceleration factors were, we could, in fact, try to correct these ages to give the correct ages from a biblical timescale. What continuing research is happening? Well, I'm planning to collect more granite samples to look at zircons for helium diffusion. I also have a meteorite and other rock units that I'm going to look at the 4 methods on the same rock or meteorite to see if we get continuing disagreement between the results. And radio halo studies are continuing on a variety of rocks, and you'll hear more about that on Thursday night, including rocks associated with mineral and ore deposits. What about radiocarbon? Remember, radiocarbon production is controlled by the cosmic ray influx, which is in turn controlled by the Earth's magnetic field. If the Earth's magnetic field was twice as strong as it was in the 1400 years ago in the past, twice as strong as it is now, which other evidence indicates it was, that means the radiocarbon production waste was half of what it is today, back then. And that means if we go to the flood 4,300 years ago or so, the radiocarbon production rate was very, very much less than what it is today. And also we had all that carbon from all the plants and animals in the pre-flood world that swamped the radiocarbon that we find in the fossils, and so it would only make for a trivial amount of radiocarbon in the fossils, and that's what we find, trivial amounts that give apparent old ages. So if we try to do some calculations, the huge volume of carbon buried during the flood was probably 100 times the amount of carbon we have in the present day biosphere. So that would have grossly diluted the normal carbon. Yet the conventional ages, these conventional radiocarbons, all assume the radiocarbon production rate today. So if we correct these radiocarbon ages on the basis of slower, smaller amounts of radiocarbon production in the past, we can correct these numbers. And in fact, if we do that, the 50,000 years ages for the coal beds during the flood, we can shrink that down to less than 5,000 years by just dropping the assumption that using the present rate of radiocarbon production rate and the swamping of the radiocarbon with a lot more carbon during the flood. So if we can devise a recalibration factor, then we can use radiocarbon to more accurately determine ages of rocks and archaeological artefacts to match the biblical timescale, and it would become our friend and ally. So more research is currently being done on radiocarbon, including samples directly related to the biblical chronology. Well, conclusions, and we quickly wrap up here. 1, the 3 assumptions which all radioactive dating is based are not provable because the past cannot be observed and measured and tested, and therefore these assumptions are not even reasonable. The resultant millions of years ages, though unreliable and highly inflated compared to the 6,000-year biblical time frame, usually still match the relative order of the rock units being dated. In the rate research, we uncovered 5 independent lines of evidence that demonstrate that radioactive decay rates must have been grossly accelerated during one or more recent catastrophic events, especially during the flood. Therefore, the radiometric dating methods cannot be trusted to date rocks and fossils at millions of years old. However, these methods may often be used as a guide to relative ages of rock layers. And the measurable amounts of radiocarbon in fossils and deep earth diamonds is consistent with a young Earth and the recent Genesis flood. Continuing research, therefore, can help us uncover the factors that we can use for corrections so that we can transform these grossly inflated millions of years ages into the time scale of the biblical account, and therefore turn these methods from being our foe to being our friend. Well, you've been very patient. Thank you very much. That was a lot to get through.